Between March 8th and 10th, 1921, 13 men were eliminated across the remote hollows of Harlan County, Kentucky, in what would become known as the Timber War Massacre. All federal employees, all members of the United States Forest Service, all shot with hunting rifles from distances that spoke of mountain marksmanship, passed down through generations. The perpetrators weren't outlaws or moonshiners or Confederate holdouts still fighting the Civil War. They were 4 members of the Sullivan family, a father and his 3 sons moving through the Cumberland Mountains like wolves protecting their den, methodically eliminating every ranger who'd come to take what 3 generations had built. The Kentucky State Forestry Commission would later call it one of the most calculated acts of resistance in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't bootlegging, wasn't a blood feud passed down through decades, wasn't even retaliation for violence done to their family. It was 400 acres of old-growth forest that had been Sullivan land since 1847, seized by federal order, under laws the mountains had never recognized. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Harlan County, Kentucky, sprawled across 600 square miles, some of the most unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States in 1921. The Cumberland Mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks reaching over 4,000 feet, their valleys so narrow and deep that winter held on until May and returned again by October. Population stood around 31,000. Scattered across hollows and ridges where families had lived in isolation for generations, following rules older than any government. The county seat, also called Harlan, held barely 3,000 souls who knew each other's business, each other's bloodlines, and each other's grudges going back to before Kentucky was even a state. March in Harlan meant temperatures dropping to 28 degrees at night, creeping up to maybe 45 by mid-afternoon if the sun managed to break through the clouds. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves and fireplaces mixed with the sharp scent of pine sap and the metallic tang of mountain streams running ice-cold over limestone. At night, when fog settled into the hollows, you could hear owls hunting across the ridges and the distant sound of timber wolves that supposedly didn't exist anymore, but that mountain people knew better. Sound traveled strange in those mountains. Sometimes you'd hear a tree falling 2 miles away, clear as thunder. Other times, you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you until his boot snapped a branch. But 1921 was a devastating year for Appalachia. The brief economic boom that followed the Great War had collapsed. Coal mines that had employed thousands during the war effort now sat idle, their owners having extracted maximum profit and moved on. Unemployment in Harlan County hovered near 40%. Men who'd risked their lives in French trenches came home to find no work, no prospects, no way to feed families, except subsistence farming on land too steep and rocky for proper cultivation. The timber industry, which had sustained these mountains for generations, was being systematically dismantled by federal intervention disguised as conservation. The United States Forest Service, created in 1905, had spent 15 years slowly expanding its reach into Appalachia. The official narrative spoke of protecting natural resources, preventing erosion, ensuring sustainable forestry practices for future generations. The reality, as mountain people understood it, was government seizure of ancestral land under the authority of laws, written by men who'd never walked these ridges, never felled a tree, never understood that in places like Harlan County, land wasn't just property. It was identity, inheritance, the only wealth poor families would ever possess. The program had a deceptively simple structure. Federal surveyors would identify privately held forest land, usually land that had been in families for generations but had never been formally registered because mountain people didn't trust government record keeping. The Forest Service would then offer to purchase the land at prices determined by federal assessors who had no understanding of what that timber was actually worth. If landowners refused, which they almost always did, the government would invoke eminent domain, seize the property anyway, and force the families to accept whatever compensation the courts decided was fair. Fair in this context meant whatever kept the federal budget manageable. By early 1921, the Forest Service had acquired over 200,000 acres across eastern Kentucky. Entire communities had been displaced, their sawmills shut down, their livelihoods eliminated in the name of conservation. For families like the Sullivans, who'd worked timber for 3 generations, who'd built their entire existence around forest knowledge, passed from father to son, the federal program wasn't conservation. It was theft, legal theft, sanctioned by distant courts and enforced by armed rangers, but theft nonetheless. And in the mountains, where codes older than law still governed how men settled their debts, theft demanded an answer. Isaiah Sullivan was 58 years old that March, though he looked closer to 70. He stood 6 feet tall, but decades of physical labor had given him a forward stoop that made him appear shorter. His face was weathered like old leather. Deep lines carved around his eyes from squinting into sun and sawdust. A thick beard gone completely white, despite the dark hair that still held on at his temples. His most distinctive feature was a scar that ran across his entire right hand, palm to knuckles. A souvenir from a sawmill accident in 1903 when a blade had caught him wrong. The hand had healed crooked. 2 fingers, the middle and ring finger, no longer straightened completely. But Isaiah could still grip an axe, still feel the grain of wood, still judge the age of a tree by touch alone. Every morning Isaiah woke at 4:45, made coffee in a percolator so old his wife had brought it to their marriage in 1885, and sat at the kitchen table in darkness, drinking coffee strong enough to strip paint while he planned his day. He didn't pray, though he kept a Bible on the table, his father's Bible, with family births and deaths recorded on the inside cover going back to 1823. He just sat, smoked hand-rolled cigarettes, and thought about the work ahead. By 5:30, regardless of whether he'd be out the door, checking the timber lines that stretched across 400 acres of forest his grandfather had cleared and claimed in 1847. He'd married Eleanor May Hutchins in 1885, right after his father had died in a logging accident, leaving Isaiah at 22 to run an operation he barely understood. Eleanor had been 19, daughter of a coal miner, strong enough to work alongside men when the timber needed hauling. They'd had 4 sons. Jacob was 32 now, back from France with shrapnel still lodged in his left shoulder and nightmares that woke him screaming some nights. Caleb was 29, the calculated one, the one who could read and write well enough to keep books. Samuel was 27, built like an oak tree, able to fell timber faster than any man Isaiah had ever seen. Thomas was 24, the youngest, newly married to a girl named Sarah with a baby daughter born just 3 months earlier. Eleanor had died in January of 1919, pneumonia that turned to fever, gone in 4 days despite everything the county doctor tried. Isaiah had buried her in the family plot up on the ridge, next to his parents and grandparents, overlooking the forest that had sustained them for 74 years. What Isaiah valued most wasn't money, though God knew timber had kept his family fed through depressions and wars, and every economic catastrophe the mountains had endured. What he valued was the land itself, the 400 acres his grandfather, Ezra Sullivan, had claimed in 1847 after walking down from Virginia with nothing but an axe, a rifle, and a determination to build something permanent in a world that kept taking from poor men. Ezra had cleared the first 20 acres by hand, built a cabin, married a Cherokee woman named Mary, whose family had somehow avoided the removals, and started a timber operation that was less business than survival strategy. The Sullivan technique had been perfected over 3 generations. They didn't clear cut like the big lumber companies that had started appearing in the 1890s. They harvested selectively, taking mature trees, leaving younger growth, understanding that forest management was a long game that required thinking in decades, not seasons. Ezra had taught his son Nathan. Nathan had taught Isaiah. And Isaiah had taught his boys. The knowledge wasn't written down. It was demonstrated, corrected, absorbed through years of working alongside men who could read a forest the way some people read books. The timber itself was extraordinary. Old-growth oak, some trees over 200 years old, their trunks 6 feet in diameter. Black walnut worth more per board foot than most men earned in a month. Cherry wood with grains so perfect it looked like water flowing. Hickory strong enough for wagon axles and tool handles. In 1921, that standing timber was worth approximately $75,000, an impossible fortune for mountain people, the equivalent of what a coal miner might earn in 300 years of underground labor. But the timber wasn't just money. It was identity. Every tree the Sullivans felled, they'd planted 2 in its place. The sawmill his grandfather had built in 1861 still ran, powered by a water wheel on Clover Fork Creek, the same creek that had powered it for 60 years. The techniques they used, the way they judged grain, the precision of their cuts, these were skills that couldn't be bought or taught in any school. This was inheritance in its truest form. The only legacy Isaiah had to pass to his children in a world where men like him had nothing else. His father had made him promise, lying in the family plot after a tree had fallen wrong in 1885, crushing him from the waist down. Isaiah had been there, 22 years old, watching his father die slowly over 6 hours because they couldn't move him and couldn't stop the bleeding. His father's last words, whispered through pain, had been simple. This land stays, Sullivan land. You promise me. You keep it for your sons. The United States Forest Service had come to Harlan County in the summer of 1920, though rumors of their arrival had circulated for months before. The first sign was surveyors, federal employees with clipboards and measuring equipment, walking property lines that had never been formally surveyed, marking trees with paint, taking notes about timber quality and density. They moved in pairs, always polite, always professional, explaining they were conducting assessments for potential federal acquisition of forest land. They spoke about conservation, about protecting resources, about ensuring sustainable management for future generations. They never mentioned that the families who'd managed these forests for 3, 4, 5 generations would be forced out. Isaiah first encountered them in late July of 1920. He'd been checking timber growth on the northern section of Sullivan land when he'd heard voices, looked up and seen 2 men in federal uniforms measuring a massive oak that Isaiah's grandfather had deliberately left standing in 1853. The tree was a landmark, a marker point the Sullivan family had used for navigation for 67 years. The surveyors had marked it with yellow paint, a number, coordinates. Isaiah had approached them calmly, asked what they were doing. The older surveyor, a man named Hutchins from Lexington, had explained they were mapping federal forest land. Isaiah had corrected him politely but firmly. This wasn't federal land. This was Sullivan land. Had been Sullivan land since 1847. His grandfather had cleared it, his father had worked it, he worked it now, and his sons would work it when he was gone. Hutchins had consulted his papers, showed Isaiah maps with boundaries that included all 400 acres of Sullivan timber, explained that the land had never been formally registered, which meant, under federal law, it was unclaimed property suitable for government acquisition. Isaiah had pointed out that his family had been paying county taxes on that land for 73 years, which seemed like formal recognition enough. Hutchins had shrugged sympathetically. County taxes didn't establish federal ownership rights. The law was clear. Isaiah had told them to leave. Hutchins had said they'd be back. And they were, throughout August and September, mapping, measuring, documenting every tree on Sullivan land, while Isaiah watched, growing angrier each day, but controlling himself because mountain code dictated you gave warnings before you acted, you tried talking before you started shooting. By October, Isaiah understood what was coming. He'd heard stories from other counties, other families, who'd faced the same federal intrusion. The pattern was always identical: surveys, then official notification, then a purchase offer at a fraction of the timber's value, then seizure if you refused. There was no negotiating, no appealing to courts that sided with federal authority over mountain tradition. The law said the government could take what it wanted. Mountain law said no man takes what 3 generations built. Those 2 laws were about to collide. Jacob Sullivan, 32, had returned from France in November 1918 with German shrapnel lodged in his left shoulder blade. The field hospital doctor said removing it risked paralyzing his arm, so they left it there. The shrapnel shifted when he moved, grinding against bone. He stood 6 feet 2 inches, with dark hair and hands scarred from timber work and warfare. When he looked at you, his eyes suggested he'd already seen the worst things men could do. Caleb Sullivan, 29, stood 5 feet 10 inches and talked through problems. He'd taught himself mathematics and accounting, kept financial records so precise You could track every board foot sold back to 1912. His gift was numbers calculating when to sell timber and when to hold. He wore spectacles, unusual for mountain people, small round glasses that made him look scholarly despite calloused hands. Samuel Sullivan, 27, was pure physical power. 6 feet 1 inch, 230 pounds, all muscle from swinging axes since age 10. Samuel could fell a tree in 12 minutes that took 2 men half an hour. He could carry timber loads requiring horse teams. He didn't talk much but worked with intensity bordering on obsession. In the forest, nothing else existed. Thomas Sullivan, youngest at 24, was still figuring out who he was. He'd married Sarah Nichols in June 1920. Their daughter Grace had been born 3 months ago. Holding her, Thomas understood what his father meant about legacy, about building for people you'd never meet. He was the gentlest brother, most likely to find compromise, who still believed you could reason with authority. Every morning, all four woke before dawn. By 5:30, regardless of whether they'd be working timber alongside their father, they'd learned Isaiah's techniques: selective harvesting that preserved forest while providing income, reading grain in standing trees, precision cuts, maximizing usable lumber. They worked as a unit. Jacob handled heavy felling. Caleb managed logistics and sales. Samuel provided raw power. Thomas worked the sawmill. What bound them wasn't just blood or tradition. It was understanding that the 400 acres represented everything their family would ever have. Jacob had seen Europe, had walked through French cities with museums and universities and wealth accumulated over centuries. He'd come home knowing mountain families would never have that inheritance. The timber was it. The land was it. Caleb understood through numbers. He'd calculated that at current timber prices, managed properly, the 400 acres could support 4 families indefinitely. Clear-cut it or lose it to federal seizure, and 1 generation from now the Sullivan name would mean nothing. Samuel understood instinctively without calculation. The forest was who he was. Thomas understood through grace. 3 months old, sleeping in a cradle their grandfather had built, representing a future that required the land stay Sullivan land. When the seizure notice arrived, all 4 brothers had the same thought. Not if, when. Not whether to fight. How. Chief Ranger William Joseph Pritchard arrived in Harlan County on January 5, 1921, with 12 men under his command and orders to acquire timber rights to approximately 47,000 acres of Cumberland Mountain forest. He was 44 years old, a career federal employee from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who'd spent 20 years working his way up through the Forest Service bureaucracy, from surveyor to district supervisor to his current position as regional acquisition chief. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, built solid rather than heavy, with a thick mustache gone gray at the edges and hands that showed ink stains rather than calluses. He wasn't a bad man. That was important to understand. He was a man doing his job, following procedures, implementing policies designed by people far above his pay grade, who genuinely believed, that federal forest management was superior to the chaotic, unregulated, private ownership that had led to clear-cutting disasters across Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Pritchard's 12 rangers were a mixed group. 8 of them were veterans, men who'd served in France and come home to find limited employment opportunities, men for whom federal service offered steady pay, a uniform, and a sense of purpose. The other 4 were younger, recent forestry school graduates who'd been taught that scientific management principles could save America's forests from the rapacious exploitation of the 19th century. They carried rifles, standard issue for federal rangers operating in remote territory, but most of them had never fired at anything except deer. They weren't soldiers. They were civil servants with weapons training. The Rangers established their base camp 3 miles outside Harlantown, near the confluence of Poor Fork and Clover Fork creeks. They worked in pairs, surveying land, meeting with property owners, explaining the federal acquisition process with varying degrees of sensitivity depending on the individual ranger's temperament. Some genuinely tried to help families understand their options. Others treated mountain people like ignorant hillbillies who should be grateful the government was willing to pay anything for land that had never been properly developed. This variation in approach created confusion, resentment, and a growing sense among Harlan County residents that they were being invaded by an occupying force that spoke English but might as well have been speaking German for all the understanding they showed of mountain culture. By mid-January, Pritchard had identified the Sullivan timber operation as a priority acquisition. The survey data showed exceptional old-growth forest, well managed, with timber quality that exceeded most of what they'd assessed in surrounding territory. The 400 acres represented exactly the kind of resource the Forest Service wanted to protect and manage, according to federal standards. Pritchard scheduled a meeting with Isaiah Sullivan for January 12th. Isaiah Sullivan walked into that meeting on January 12th knowing exactly what Pritchard was going to say. He'd heard the same speech delivered to 6 other families in the county over the past month. He listened quietly while Pritchard explained that the Sullivan timberland had been identified for federal acquisition, that the Forest Service was prepared to offer $8,000 for the 400 acres and all standing timber, that this was a generous offer based on current market assessments, and that while the government preferred voluntary sales, it had the authority to proceed with eminent domain if necessary. $8,000 for timber worth $75,000, for land that had been Sullivan property for 74 years, for the only inheritance Isaiah had to leave his children. $8,000. Isaiah let Pritchard finish his presentation before he responded. His voice was calm, controlled, the kind of quiet that people who knew him understood meant he was angrier than if he'd been shouting. He explained to Pritchard that the land had been Sullivan land since 1847, that his grandfather had cleared it with his own hands, that his father had died working it, that he'd raised 4 sons on what that timber provided, that every tree currently standing on those 400 acres had been deliberately managed, cultivated, protected for 3 generations, that the Sullivan family had never clear-cut, had never over-harvested, had practiced better conservation than any federal program could mandate because it was their land, and they understood that destroying it would destroy their children's future. Pritchard listened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. Then he explained patiently, as if speaking to a child, that the law was clear. Land that hadn't been formally registered with federal authorities was subject to government acquisition for public use. That the Sullivan family's tenure, however long and however well-intentioned, didn't establish legal ownership in the eyes of federal courts. That $8,000 was actually above the average compensation for similar acreage in eastern Kentucky. That Isaiah should consider accepting the offer and finding other employment, perhaps in the coal mines, which were always looking for experienced workers. Isaiah had looked at Pritchard for a long moment. Then he'd said very clearly, so there could be no misunderstanding, "This land has been Sullivan land since before there was a Forest Service, since before there was a Department of Agriculture, since before your grandfather was born. You're not taking it." Pritchard had responded equally clearly, "Mr. Sullivan, with respect, the law says different. You have 30 days to consider our offer. After that, we proceed with acquisition, whether you agree or not." Isaiah had stood, walked out without another word, and ridden his horse back to the Sullivan homestead, knowing that talking was finished. The official seizure notice arrived on February 3, 1921, delivered by a federal marshal who rode up to the Sullivan property at mid-morning, found Isaiah repairing fence posts, and handed him an envelope sealed with government stamps. The marshal was apologetic, a local man named Henderson who'd known the Sullivan family for years and who clearly hated being part of this process. He waited while Isaiah read the document, then rode away quickly, as if staying might associate him with what the paper represented. The notice was 3 pages of legal language that translated to simple theft dressed in official terminology. The United States Forest Service, acting under authority granted by the Weeks Act of 1911 and subsequent amendments, hereby notified Isaiah Sullivan that the 400 acres designated as Sullivan timberland in southeastern Harlan County had been identified for federal acquisition. The government offered compensation in the amount of $8,000 for said property and all standing timber. The Sullivan family had 30 days until March 5, 1921, to cease all timber operations, remove all personal property and equipment, and vacate the land. Failure to comply would result in forced removal and potential criminal charges for interfering with federal operations. Isaiah read it 3 times, standing in the cold February wind, feeling something shift inside his chest. Not surprise. He'd known this was coming. But seeing it in official language signed by people he'd never met, sanctioned by courts that had never seen his land, made it real in a way the meeting with Pritchard hadn't been. They were taking it. They were actually taking 74 years of family history, 3 generations of work, the only valuable thing the Sullivan family had ever created, and they were calling it legal. That night, Isaiah gathered his 4 sons around the kitchen table. Martha, Thomas's wife, took baby Grace upstairs, understanding without being told that what was about to be discussed wasn't for women or children. Isaiah laid the seizure notice on the table, smoothed it flat with his scarred hand, and said, "They're stealing our land. They're doing it legal, with courts and laws and federal authority. But they're stealing it just the same as if they'd come with guns in the night. And I need to know, right now, if you boys are willing to stand with me when I tell them no." Jacob spoke first. "We stand, all of us." "Whatever that means." Caleb nodded. Samuel just looked at his father and said, "Of course." Thomas hesitated, thinking of Grace upstairs, of Sarah, who'd already lost her father to a mining accident, but then he met his father's eyes and said, quietly, "We're Sullivan men. We protect what's ours. February 18th, 1921. Temperature at dawn, 23 degrees. Samuel Sullivan had been checking timber growth on the western ridge when he heard voices, looked down through trees, and saw 4 federal rangers with paint cans and brushes. Not surveying, marking. Bright yellow paint, numbers, coordinates. Government property designations on trees. 3 generations of Sullivan men had protected. Samuel watched 20 minutes, jaw clenched, as rangers moved methodically through forest, painting marks on oak trees older than Kentucky itself. He recognized one ranger, a young man named Cooper, who'd been polite during surveys. Cooper wasn't apologetic now. He was doing his job, marking federal timber like he had every right. When Samuel came down at mid-morning, his face told the story before he spoke. Isaiah was at the sawmill with Jacob and Caleb. Samuel walked to where his father stood, waited until Isaiah looked up. Then Samuel said quietly, "They're marking trees. Yellow paint. Numbers. On our land. Like they already own it." Isaiah set down his saw, wiped sawdust from his hands, asked how many rangers. 4. Asked where. Western Ridge, near the old territorial marker. Isaiah nodded, not surprised, but something in his expression changed, hardened. The moment when patience ends and something else begins. "They're not surveying anymore," Isaiah said. "They're not negotiating. They're taking possession." He looked at his 3 older sons, each understanding. The rangers had crossed a line, not a legal line. They'd crossed from threat to action, from words to deeds, from maybe to definitely. That night Isaiah sat alone in the kitchen long after his sons had gone to sleep. He read from his father's Bible, not for comfort but for confirmation. The Old Testament had clear guidance on what a man did when thieves came. He thought about his grandfather Ezra, who'd walked into these mountains with nothing and built something permanent. About his father dying from a logging accident, making Isaiah promise to keep the land Sullivan land. About Jacob, Caleb, Samuel, Thomas. About Grace, 3 months old, who'd never know her heritage if it was stolen. The code was clear, had always been clear in these mountains. When a man steals your legacy, when authority offers no protection, when law becomes the weapon of theft rather than shield of justice, you answer. You answer decisively. You answer in a way that makes clear what happens when you push mountain people too far. Isaiah made his decision that night. Not in anger, though anger was there. In cold calculation. In acceptance of what came next. In recognition that some things were worth more than law, more than peace, more than life itself. Legacy was one of those things. And men who tried to steal it were about to learn why the mountains had their own laws that predated any government. Laws written in blood and defended in blood. Laws that said a man protects what's his, no matter the cost. The last week of February passed in strange silence at the Sullivan homestead. Isaiah rose each morning at 4:45, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table smoking while the house slept. But he wasn't planning timber work anymore. He was planning something else. Working through logistics, with the same methodical precision he'd applied to forest management for 36 years. How many rangers, where they camped, their patrol patterns, how they moved through terrain they didn't know, following maps that couldn't capture what 3 generations had taught the Sullivan family. Jacob understood what was coming before his father said anything. He'd seen that look in France, in officers who'd calculated that some objectives required accepting casualties, that some orders meant sending men to die for strategic necessity. He'd carried out those orders, led men over trench walls knowing some wouldn't return. The moral weight hadn't bothered him in France because the enemy was clear, the cause was clear, the righteousness assumed. This was different. The Rangers weren't Germans. They were Americans, federal employees, men with families, doing jobs assigned by legitimate authority. Killing them would be murder by any legal definition. But Jacob had learned something in France most people never understood. Sometimes legal definitions and moral reality existed in different universes. Sometimes you did what you had to do and lived with consequences because the alternative, letting injustice stand unopposed, was worse than any punishment courts could impose. He'd said as much to his father on February 24th, standing in the barn speaking quietly, so Thomas wouldn't overhear. We all came back from France. We know what war is. We know what it costs. Sometimes you fight, or you lose everything. Isaiah had looked at him, seeing not his son but a fellow soldier, someone who'd crossed boundaries most men never approached. This isn't war, Isaiah said. War has rules, endings, some pretense of honor. This is just killing. Once we start, we can't stop until it's finished. You understand? Jacob understood perfectly. Caleb's struggle was different. He dealt in numbers, calculations, rational assessment of costs and benefits. He'd spent the week running numbers in his head, trying to find some equation that made sense. 13 Rangers versus 4 Sullivan men. Odds weren't terrible with terrain advantage and surprise. But the aftermath. Federal response would be overwhelming. They'd be hunted, caught, tried, probably executed. The timber would be seized anyway, the family name destroyed, Sarah and Grace left with nothing. Every calculation led to the same conclusion. Fighting was suicide. Fighting changed nothing except adding bodies. But Caleb understood something numbers couldn't capture: dignity, legacy, the ability to look at yourself and know you didn't surrender when challenged. His great-grandfather had walked into these mountains rather than live under someone else's rules. That defiance was the inheritance. That refusal to submit was what being a Sullivan meant. Some things mattered more than survival. Some principles required blood. March 1st, 1921. Isaiah gathered his sons in the kitchen after Sarah had taken Grace upstairs to bed. The temperature outside had dropped to 19 degrees. Wind rattled the windows. The wood stove burned hot, making the room almost uncomfortably warm. But Isaiah wanted everyone awake, alert, understanding the weight of what they were about to discuss. He laid the seizure notice on the table, smoothed it flat with his scarred hand, and spoke without preamble. They're taking our land. They've already started marking trees like they own them. In 4 days, March 5th, the seizure becomes official. After that, we're trespassing on our own property. They'll bring in logging crews, federal crews, and everything 3 generations built disappears. Becomes government property managed by men who've never seen these mountains before last month. He paused, looked at each son in turn. Jacob met his eyes steadily. Caleb looked down at the table. Samuel stared straight ahead. Thomas glanced toward the stairs where his wife and daughter slept. I'm not asking you to do anything, Isaiah continued. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop them. And stopping them means removing the rangers from our land. All of them, permanently. I need to know right now if you're willing to stand with me. The silence lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt longer. Jacob spoke first, his voice flat, emotionless, the tone he'd used when giving orders in France. We stand, all of us, whatever that means. Caleb nodded slowly, still looking at the table, wrestling with numbers that didn't add up, but knowing some decisions transcended calculation. We're past negotiation. They made that choice when they started marking trees. So yes, I'm with you. Samuel just looked at his father and said, "Of course." 2 words that carried absolute commitment, no hesitation, no doubt. The forest was who he was. Defending it wasn't even a choice. It was identity. Thomas was last to speak. He sat quietly, thinking about Grace upstairs, 3 months old, sleeping in a cradle their grandfather had built from Sullivan timber. Thinking about Sarah, who'd married him, knowing mountain life was hard, but not knowing it might make her a widow. He wanted to say no, wanted to argue there had to be another way, wanted to believe federal courts might listen, that appeals might work, that violence wasn't necessary. But he'd spent 24 years watching his father never back down from hard decisions, watching his brothers carry themselves like men who understood that some principles were worth dying for. And he'd held Grace, felt the weight of her in his arms, understood that what he did now would define what inheritance she received. Would she inherit land and legacy, or just stories about a family that used to matter? Thomas met his father's eyes and said quietly, "We're Sullivan men. We protect what's ours. When do we start?" Jacob took over operational planning because he had training the others lacked. 3 years in the American Expeditionary Forces, 6 months of combat, experience with coordinated attacks on defended positions. The Rangers weren't soldiers, but they were armed federal employees who'd respond to threats with force. This required military precision. He started with reconnaissance. For 3 days, March 2nd through 4th, the Sullivan brothers tracked Ranger movements. Jacob and Samuel would leave before dawn, move through forest, invisible as smoke, observe the federal camp from positions Rangers never knew were occupied. They documented everything. 13 Rangers total. Pritchard plus 12 subordinates. They worked in pairs, patrolling different sections. They returned to base camp by nightfall. They posted guards at night, 2-hour rotations, but guards weren't particularly alert. They were in Kentucky, not France. Civil servants, not soldiers. Caleb mapped it all. Patrol routes, timing, which pairs went where and when. He identified the pattern. Rangers 1 and 2 covered the northern section, returning to camp around 4 in the afternoon. 3 and 4 worked eastern ridges. 5 and 6 surveyed southern hollows. The pattern repeated with slight variations, predictable enough to exploit. Pritchard stayed at base camp, most days reviewing survey data, writing reports, managing administrative work that federal bureaucracy demanded, even in remote mountain operations. The plan, Jacob developed was simple. Catch them in pairs, away from support, in terrain where Sullivans had every advantage. Use rifles, long-range shooting that mountain men learned as children. Don't get close. Don't risk hand-to-hand. Don't give them chance to return fire effectively. Execute quickly, methodically, moving from pair to pair before rangers understood what was happening. 3 days maximum. March 8th through 10th. By March 11th, every ranger would be dead, and the Sullivan family would face whatever consequences came next. Thomas asked the question nobody else would. What about after? When federal marshals come? When state police come? When the army comes? Jacob's answer was honest. We probably die, or spend the rest of our lives in prison. There's no scenario where we do this and walk away free, but we walk away knowing we didn't surrender, knowing we fought, knowing that 50 years from now, people will remember the Sullivan family stood up when government tried to steal what was theirs. Isaiah listened to his sons plan his war and felt something break inside his chest. Pride, maybe, or grief. Probably both. These were good men. Strong men. Men who'd learned everything he'd taught about honor and legacy and codes that mattered more than law. And he was leading them to death or imprisonment because he couldn't let go of 400 acres of trees. But he also couldn't live knowing he'd surrendered. Couldn't face his father's grave knowing he'd broken the promise. Couldn't look at Grace and tell her Sullivan land was gone because her grandfather was too scared to fight. The code demanded blood, and blood was what the mountains would get. March 7th, 1921. The Sullivan family's last night before the killing started. Temperature at dusk, 26 degrees, clear sky, moon nearly full. Sarah knew something was wrong. She'd known for days. The way Thomas looked at Grace, the way brothers talked in low voices that stopped when she entered a room, the way Isaiah sat cleaning rifles already clean. She'd asked Thomas directly, "What's happening?" He'd tried to lie, but Sarah had grown up in coal country, had watched miners prepare for violent strikes, had seen men clean weapons and write letters and say goodbye without saying the words. She knew what men looked like preparing to die. "Tell me the truth," she said. "Whatever you're planning, I deserve to know." So Thomas told her. Everything. The seizure, the rangers, his father's decision, Jacob's plan, the likelihood they'd all be dead or imprisoned within a week. Sarah listened without interrupting, holding Grace, feeling her daughter's heartbeat against her own. When Thomas finished, Sarah was quiet. Then, "Do you have to go? Can't your brothers do this without you?" Thomas wanted to say yes, wanted to stay with her and Grace, let others handle the violence, preserve some future. But he'd already made his choice, already committed, already understood that being a Sullivan man meant standing with family when it mattered most. "I have to go," he said. "If I don't, I'd have to live knowing I let my brothers fight alone, knowing I was too scared to defend what's ours. That's not something I could live with." Sarah nodded, tears on her face, but no argument. She understood mountain codes, even if she hated them. That night, the four brothers sat around the kitchen table one last time. Isaiah brought out his father's Bible, opened it to the page where family births and deaths were recorded, going back to 1823. He read the names aloud: Ezra Sullivan, Nathan Sullivan, Isaiah Sullivan, Jacob, Caleb, Samuel, Thomas, Grace. "This is who we are," Isaiah said. "This is what we're protecting. Not just trees, not just land, names, history. The knowledge that Sullivan family has mattered in these mountains for 74 years and will continue mattering as long as one of us draws breath." Each son wrote letters that night. Letters to be opened if they didn't survive. Jacob documented what they'd done and why. Caleb explained the mathematics of dignity. Samuel wrote 3 sentences Thomas wrote to Grace about legacy and honor and the price men sometimes pay for principles. At midnight, Isaiah stood, collected the letters, placed them in his father's Bible. Tomorrow morning before dawn, they'd begin. Tomorrow morning, 13 men would start dying because government thought law mattered more than justice. Tomorrow morning, the Sullivan family would discover whether their code was worth the blood it would cost. March 8th, 1921. Temperature at dawn, 21 degrees. The Sullivan brothers left their homestead at 4:15 in the morning, moving through darkness so complete you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. They carried Winchester rifles, model 1894, .30 caliber, weapons they'd used since childhood. Jacob led, following trails only Sullivan men knew. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. By 5:30 they'd reached their first position, a ridge overlooking the northern patrol route where Rangers Davis and Morrison would pass around 7 o'clock. Jacob checked sight lines, confirmed distance at approximately 200 yards, accounted for wind coming down from the peaks. Samuel positioned himself 30 yards west, creating crossfire that eliminated any escape route. Caleb and Thomas held back, watching the southern approach. At 6:53, exactly on schedule, Rangers Davis and Morrison appeared on the trail below. Davis was 26, from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a veteran who'd served in France. Morrison was 31, married, 2 children, a forestry school graduate who'd joined federal service believing he'd help protect America's natural resources. They walked casually, talking, completely unaware they had 7 minutes left to live. Jacob fired first at 7 o'clock precisely. The shot caught Davis in the chest, dropping him instantly. Morrison had maybe 2 seconds to understand before Samuel's rifle spoke, and Morrison fell beside his partner. Neither man suffered. Both died before hitting the ground. The Sullivan brothers waited 15 minutes, confirming no movement, before descending to verify. Then they moved south. Rangers Patterson and Cole were surveying timber on the eastern ridge when the Sullivan brothers found them at 11:23. Patterson, age 28, had fought at Belleau Wood, survived some of the worst combat of the war, only to die on a Kentucky mountain because he'd accepted a federal job. Cole, 24, had joined the Forest Service because his father had been a ranger. They never saw their killers. Jacob and Samuel fired simultaneously from concealed positions, 230 yards distant, both dead before noon. By 4 in the afternoon, Rangers Henderson and Walsh were overdue at base camp. They'd been working the southern hollows. Jacob tracked them to Clover Fork Creek, where they'd stopped to refill canteens. Henderson, 32, married with 3 children. Walsh, 29, engaged to be married in June. They died at 4:47, shot from positions they never identified, falling into creek that ran red for 30 yards downstream. 6 rangers dead in one day. Pritchard and the remaining 7 men discovered the bodies of Davis and Morrison at dusk. The realization hit immediately. This wasn't an accident. This was systematic elimination. March 9th began with Pritchard understanding his command was under attack. He gathered the 7 remaining Rangers at dawn, armed them, organized defensive positions around base camp. His plan was simple: consolidate, survive, send for reinforcements. But the Sullivan brothers weren't attacking the camp. They were hunting stragglers, eliminating threats methodically, using terrain knowledge no federal employee could match. Rangers Thompson and Stewart had been caught away from camp overnight, trapped by darkness while surveying distant ridges. They tried returning to base at first light. Jacob intercepted them at 6:30 on a narrow trail where forest pressed close. Thompson, age 27, died instantly. Stewart, 34, a father of 4, managed one shot that went wide before Samuel's rifle ended him. 2 more dead before breakfast. Pritchard made his second mistake around noon. He sent Rangers Wilson and Martinez to scout the route Thompson and Stewart should have taken. Wilson was 41, the oldest ranger, 19 years with the Forest Service. Martinez was 23, the youngest, fresh from university. They found Thompson and Stewart at 1:15. They died beside them 10 minutes later, shot from positions so well concealed that even in death, their eyes showed confusion. By evening, March 9th, Pritchard had 3 Rangers left besides himself: Ferguson, age 30, O'Brien, age 28, and Cooper, the young ranger who'd been polite during surveys. They barricaded themselves in camp, built fires for light, posted rotating guards. But mountain darkness was absolute. The Sullivan brothers could approach within 50 yards and remain invisible. March 10th. Pritchard tried leading his remaining men back toward Harlantown at dawn, abandoning camp, seeking safety. But the Sullivan brothers had anticipated this. They'd positioned themselves along the only viable route where trail narrowed, where retreat was impossible. Ferguson died at 7:18, O'Brien at 7:43. Both shot from such distance that Pritchard and Cooper never saw their attackers. Pritchard and Cooper ran, not retreating tactically but running in pure panic. They separated, hoping to divide their pursuers. It didn't matter. Caleb tracked Cooper to an abandoned mine shaft at 9:30. Cooper was 24 years old. He died begging, pleading he'd just been following orders, never wanted to take anyone's land. Caleb shot him anyway. Orders didn't matter. The code demanded completion. Pritchard made it farthest, surviving until noon, covering nearly 8 miles through terrain that should have killed him from exhaustion. Isaiah found him at Clover Fork Creek, the same creek where Henderson and Walsh had died. Pritchard was drinking water, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his canteen. Isaiah stepped from the tree line with his rifle lowered, not aimed, giving Pritchard the dignity of facing his death aware. Pritchard looked up, saw Isaiah, and something like relief crossed his face. Relief that the chase was over. Relief that he'd at least see the man killing him. "You're Sullivan," Pritchard said. Not a question. Isaiah nodded. I'm going to kill you now, Isaiah said quietly. Not because I hate you, not because you're a bad man, but because you tried to take what's mine. And mountain law says that requires an answer. Pritchard didn't beg, didn't plead, didn't try, explaining he'd just been following federal orders. He just said, my wife's name is Catherine. She lives in Harrisburg. Someone should tell her I died quickly, that I didn't suffer. Isaiah promised he would. Then he raised his rifle and shot William Joseph Pritchard through the heart at 12:17 on March 10th, 1921. 13 Rangers dead across 3 days. 13 men who'd woken up on March 8th, believing they were doing legitimate government work. All dead now. All killed by 4 mountain men defending land that legally belonged to the federal government, but morally, by every code the mountains recognized, belonged to the Sullivan family. The Sullivan brothers gathered at their homestead that evening. They'd accomplished what they'd set out to do. They'd eliminated the immediate threat. They defended their land with violence so absolute it would be remembered for generations. And now they waited for consequences they knew were coming. Sarah had kept Grace upstairs during the 3 days, away from windows, away from any possibility of stray bullets. When Thomas returned on the evening of March 10th, covered in mud and blood that wasn't his, Sarah looked at him without speaking, just held him while he cried, not from guilt, from the weight of what he'd become, a father who'd killed men so his daughter might inherit land she'd never be allowed to keep. Kentucky State Police discovered the first bodies on March 11th. By March 12th, federal marshals were en route. By March 13th, newspapers across the country carried the story, the Timber War Massacre. 13 federal employees, murdered in 3 days by a family of mountain men who believed their property rights superseded government authority. Editorial opinions split predictably. Eastern newspapers called it domestic terrorism, demanded military intervention. Rural papers, particularly in Appalachia, were quieter, understanding that sometimes government overreach created its own monsters. The Sullivan brothers didn't run. They stayed at the homestead, working timber, living normal lives, while the state mobilized against them. Isaiah cleaned his rifles and waited. Jacob wrote letters to newspapers explaining exactly what they'd done and why. Caleb calculated how long before arrest came. Samuel just kept cutting trees, as if 3 days of killing had changed nothing about who he was. Federal marshals arrived on March 17th with 40 armed men. The Sullivan brothers were in the middle of their breakfast when they first heard the sound of horses' hooves approaching. Isaiah stood up, his face grim, and told his sons to walk outside with their hands visible. They had already killed 13 men, and there was no reason to die resisting arrest now. The trial began in Lexington on September 12, 1921, and lasted for 6 weeks. The evidence against them was overwhelming, yet the defense argued that the dispute was rooted in property rights and government overreach. They insisted that the Sullivans had been protecting what was theirs, but the jury deliberated for 4 hours before reaching a verdict. Guilty on all counts, first-degree murder, 13 times over. The judge, unmoved by the defense's arguments, sentenced all 4 men to death by hanging. Public outcry was swift and fierce. Thousands of letters poured in from rural communities, many from people who sympathized with the Sullivans' plight. The rural populace, in particular, saw their actions as those of men who had been pushed to the brink by an unjust government. The governor, under pressure, commuted their sentences to life imprisonment. On November 3rd, the Sullivans were transferred to Eddyville State Penitentiary to serve out their sentences. Isaiah Sullivan died in prison on January 14th, 1929, at the age of 66, from heart failure. He had spent 7 years in a cell, and in all that time, he never expressed any regret for his actions. His sons, however, had to continue living with the consequences of their choices. Jacob served his sentence until December of 1954, when he was released at the age of 65. He lived out the remainder of his life in solitude and died alone in 1967. He never married. Caleb served until March of 1957, and upon his release, he returned to Harlan County. There he found that the 400 acres of land that had once belonged to his family were now incorporated into the Daniel Boone National Forest. The land that had been the Sullivan family's legacy was now federal property. Caleb died in 1963, never having truly returned to his former life. Samuel served until August of 1959 and died in 1965. Thomas was released in May of 1961 at the age of 64, and after his release, he moved to West Virginia. There, he reconnected with Grace, who was now 41, married, and living her own life. They met only once in those years, for about 30 minutes, but neither had much to say. Thomas died on November 13th, 1973, at the age of 76. The Sullivan timberland was seized by the government and became federal property. Today, hikers stroll along trails that wind through the area, unaware of the history that took place there. The old sawmill, which had been built in 1861, collapsed in 1978. The ruins are still visible if you know where to look, but there is no memorial to mark what happened there. No plaque commemorates the Sullivans, their legacy, or the history of their land. The town and the country simply moved on. But the story of the Sullivan family persists. It remains a topic of debate. Some people see them as patriots, fighting for their land and their way of life. Others see them as murderers, responsible for the deaths of 13 men. Both perspectives exist, and both are held to be true by different people. The uncomfortable truth is that the story is not black and white. It is complex and messy, because the truth always is. Retired U.S. Marshal James Crawford, who had been involved in the case, testified at the trial. In a 1987 interview, he reflected on his experience. Legally, the Sullivan family were mass murderers. Morally, they were desperate men defending their legacy in a system that offered them no protection. I enforced the law. But law and justice aren't always the same. I've lived with that contradiction for 66 years. So was Isaiah Sullivan a murderer? Yes. He planned and executed 13 killings with premeditation. He turned his sons into killers, and in doing so, destroyed their futures. But was he also a father trying to protect 74 years of family legacy? Yes, he was that too. The uncomfortable reality is that both of these things can be true at the same time. Isaiah Sullivan was both a murderer and a father, just as his sons were both victims of his actions and perpetrators of their own crimes. Violence breeds violence. When one person's life is destroyed by an unjust system, it can lead to a cycle of retaliation and brutality. Broken systems create desperate people, and sometimes those desperate people will do anything to protect what they believe is theirs. The line between protecting your legacy and destroying it can be very thin. In the case of the Sullivans, that line was crossed, and the result was death, destruction, and a family torn apart. The legacy of the Sullivans is a reminder that history is often written by those who have power. The government seized their land, their freedom, and their dignity, and in doing so, they became the villains in a story that was never fully told. Yet in the end, they were also victims of a system that offered them no protection, no justice, and no chance at redemption. If this story made you think about property rights, government power, and the price of justice, please leave a like and share this video. Subscribe for more true stories that challenge what we know about right and wrong. Comment below and let me know. What would you have done in their shoes? Where do you draw the line between defending what's yours and becoming a murderer? Until next time, remember, monsters aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made, one seized acre, one federal order, one desperate March morning at a time.